Okay, guys, this is our first slide of our first unit, and this is how they will look each time. A PowerPoint slide with some bullet points over here will come up, and some pictures and so forth having to do with the bullet points you'll see there. So I'll refer to the pictures kind of as we're going through, and we'll work our way through the bullet points here. Now, since this is your first one, let me say a word here real quickly about how you need to be taking notes here. Your notes should be organized by slide. So this is our first unit on Reconstruction. So the whole unit will be called Reconstruction. The first slide is called Problems of Freedom. So in your notes, you'll want to put slide 1, Problems of Freedom. Okay? And then we'll work our way through each bullet point, top to bottom. Okay? Now, in your notes, you're going to want to have what it says on the bullet point written down. But that's not all. You're going to want to write down what I have to say about each of these. So don't try to write down word for word. You'll get better at these as we go along. You'll learn what's important enough to write down and what is sort of just story that I'm telling you. But basically, anything that I repeat a couple of times is important, so you need to write that down. Anybody's name, why they're there, what they've done, you're going to need to write that down. Places, why they are important, you're going to need to write that down. Dates, some, but not a lot. I'm not real big on dates. But basically, this is the outline of the discussion. And then you need to write what was discussed about each of these things. Okay. Now again, you will be able to use these on your quizzes. So the better notes you take, the better chance you have to do well on the quiz. So I'll highlight here as we go so you can keep up with where we are. But let's talk about the problems of freedom. And it boils down to there's really kind of three big problems. The Civil War has ended. Former slaves have been granted their freedom. But it's not like the war ends on Tuesday and we wake up Wednesday morning and go, okay, everything is great and wonderful now. We're left with a whole slew of problems after the war comes to an end that are going to have to be dealt with. So let's start talking about some of those. The first type of problem we're going to see is economic. Okay? Particularly in the South, the economy is a disaster after the war. Okay? Most of the war was fought in the South, so it was the South that was destroyed. And we see then the South having to be rebuilt. The problem is the South doesn't have the money to rebuild. They're broke. Their economy is in a shambles. Inflation is incredibly high, meaning the cost of goods. Cost has gone up while salaries and income has not. So inflation is a problem. Factories, there weren't a lot in the South, but the ones that there were destroyed during the war. So if the South is going to rebuild, it's going to have to be dependent upon the North to help it. And that does not go over well, as you can imagine. So factories are either shut down or torn down during the war. Transportation systems have been destroyed. Railroad is the main one. But railroads, if you're going to fight a war, part of the goal is to destroy your enemy's ability to move around. So railroads were destroyed during the war. So the South has no way to get goods to the places that need them. Okay? So the economy is a huge mess at the end of the war. Okay? Second, agriculture. Okay? The Southern economy was built on agriculture, particularly cotton. And here you see a little cotton plant, a bloom from a cotton plant. Cotton drove the Southern economy. And the South's biggest customer for cotton had always been the North. Once the war breaks out, that stops. So nobody's buying the South's cotton. Europe is, but the problem is they can't get it there because they don't have shipping. And what little shipping they had was being blockaded by the North during the war. So if you make your living around agriculture and suddenly you're not able to grow plants, the economy, and so we kind of go back to the economy here, your economy is going to suffer, right? Plantation owners had depended on slave labor during the war. They had counted on the fact that they were going to be able to raise, harvest, and then sell crops and have no expense because slave labor was free. Okay? Slave labor has ended. So now they're going to have to pay workers, which is going to cost plantation owners a lot of money. Okay? Seed is scarce. There's not a lot of seed. First of all, it's hard to work a farm. It's hard to grow crops during a war because these huge battlefields in the war were the farms. They were the big fields where crops were growing. That's where battles were fought. And suddenly your plantation became a battlefield. So your crops were destroyed, your fields were torn up. Where do you get seed to plant this year's crops? Well, you get seed from last year's crops. And if you didn't have any crops last year, you don't have any seed to plant this year. So seed was very scarce. Livestock. The livestock was raised in the South. That was driven off or destroyed during the war. The livestock was eaten. It was confiscated by Northern troops when they came through. So agriculture is a disaster. And if that's how you make a living, you're not going to be able to make a good living. Okay? Our third problem really is Southern defiance. White Southerners resented or defied Northern influence. They didn't want Northerners coming into the South telling them how to rebuild, how to run their lives, how to set up their governments and so forth. But the problem is that the North was the only one that could afford to help the South rebuild. So the South is kind of at an impasse here. They don't want Northern influence, but they need Northern money. Southerners had believed that they had done nothing wrong in seceding from the Union. When the South left, the North fired on the South. So the Southerners believed they had done nothing wrong. To them, many Southerners, the war still wasn't over. There was a temporary break here, but the South had not lost. Many of them refused to believe that the war was over and kept fighting it in their own ways. And we're going to talk about those here as we go through this unit. Okay? So those are the three big problems of freedom: economics, agriculture, and Southern defiance. Okay? Now that brings us to our next topic here. A group of people known as the exodusters. Okay? Exodusters. These are freed slaves, so freedmen in the South, black men, ex-slaves, okay, that gave up life in the South. They gave up the segregation, the discrimination, the violence, and all of that. And they head west, mainly to Kansas. Could be any state, but Kansas gets most of them. And here you see the sign, "Ho for Kansas," right? Brethren, friends, and fellow citizens. Real estate and the Homestead Association will leave here to pursue homes in the southwestern lands of America. Blah, blah, blah. So these are freedmen, ex-slaves, who head west to Kansas to start over. Because in the West, it didn't matter if you were black or white or whatever, as long as you weren't Native American. But a black man could get a new start in Kansas. About 25,000 black Southerners, 25,000, head west to start over, looking for their new start. Now they're called exodusters because they make an exodus. The book of Exodus in the Bible For those of you who don't know, it's the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt to the promised land. The word Exodus means literally a mass leaving or a mass exit. Right? So the people leaving the south looking for their own promised land are making an exodus. So they get called exodusters. Right? 25,000 doesn't seem like a lot, and it's not, considering there were millions and millions of slaves. The reason more don't go is simply because they have no way of getting there. You can't just pack up and start walking from Louisiana all the way to Kansas. You're not going to get very far, depending on the kindness of those around you to feed and shelter you. You got to be able to get there, and most didn't have money to pay for transportation on a stagecoach or a train or a steamboat, something like that. So more probably would have gone if they could have. Problem is they can't. Right? All right, our last topic here on this slide is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau. This was created in March of 1865. So right near the end of the war there. March of 1865. By a Union general named Oliver Howard. Oliver Howard. Okay. The Freedmen's Bureau was sort of the very beginnings of a welfare agency. They provided food, health care, job training, clothing, shelter, education, to freed blacks in the South. And not only freed blacks, but poor whites as well could get this. But mainly blacks were the ones that took advantage of it. But it's a primitive welfare agency, the beginning of the welfare system here in the country. We've got all these freed slaves, freed black men in the South, and nobody knows what to do with them. Right? The war ends, we say, congratulations, go, be free. And they're like, well, go do what? Because all they know how to do is farm. But the plantations are destroyed. Plantation owners don't want to pay workers. They're still trying to figure out a way to get slavery back. And they have nothing to do. They have nowhere to go, nowhere to call home, nothing to cling to. Well, somebody has to do something. So the federal government, northern, but now the federal government, steps up and says, okay, we'll help. We'll provide you food and shelter. We'll provide you health care. We'll take care of you. We'll get you an education. We'll train you to do a job. And the Freedmen's Bureau is what is set up to do that. The greatest success of the Freedmen's Bureau, out of everything they did, the biggest success was in education, without question. Freedmen's schools, they were called, were set up throughout the South. Freedmen's schools, right? Taught by typically white women from the North who came down to the South to work at these government jobs, to work in the schools. Here you see a picture of a freedmen's school here. Freedmen, blacks, boys and girls, men and women, yes, adults, could go to the freedmen's schools. They wanted to learn to read more than anything else because it was illegal for a slave to get an education. And most of the older generations, especially when adults went, the one thing they wanted to learn to read more than anything else was the Bible. Okay? So, education's the biggest success, the freedmen's schools here in the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? Now, if you will remind me in class, I'll tell you sort of why we had to have the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? And I'll tell you why, even though I'm not saying slavery was a good thing, I will tell you what it did provide. So, somebody remind me in class to talk about why we had to have the Freedmen's Bureau and what slavery provided. Okay, that's it for slide 1. we'll move on to slide 2.